Hey there YouTube, this is my response to yet another tag, although to be fair this one is my own fault. I suggested to Rowan Fortunewood in the comment section of one of his recent answers videos that the question he'd been asked would make the excellent basis for a new tag game, and Rowan quite cleverly turned round and said, "Fine, I tag you." Very well played indeed, Mr. Fortunewood, very well played. The basis of the question was if you had access to a time machine, all of the various philosophical problems pertaining to time travel notwithstanding, what period would you visit and whom would you like to speak to? Is there any particular historical figure or whatever that you'd like to speak to? And it's taken me a long time to actually think of a specific person. There are so many people I would have liked to sit down and actually have a talk to. I thought about visiting the 1st century and speaking to the Gnostics, the founders of the Gnostic Church. I think that would be very interesting indeed. Any number of ancient Greek philosophers and Roman emperors, etc., etc. Characters such as Siddhartha, of course, the original Buddha. That'd be fun. To actually speak to the historically existing individual would be amazing. But then an answer came to me. It's quite obvious, really, especially if you've watched my poetry videos and some of the imagery I use. It just came to me that, well, it was a eureka moment. Obviously, I'd like to visit the 18th century and speak to William Blake. William Blake is just one of those individuals whom I admire enormously. The fact that he was multi-talented, and he was a poet and a philosopher and a painter, and had various other disciplines under his belt as well, that endears me to him. But most of all, what fascinates me about the man are his beliefs. It's the fact that he had a particular connection to biblical and Christian imagery, but not in the way that was traditionally pervasive throughout the culture in which he existed. It seems that he actually eschewed the standardized and imposed form of Christianity that was pervasive throughout Britain at the time, and used its imagery to create something that was entirely more dynamic and personal. Very similar to what the Gnostic Christians proposed, in fact, which is biblical stories and imagery as a basis for mystical and metaphysical exploration. Now, William Blake himself is a fascinating man. He proclaimed to see and to speak to angels and demons on a regular basis. He was afflicted, if you like, with visions and incredibly vivid, what we would call hallucinations these days, I suppose. And he used these as the basis for what he came to eventually believe, for this overarching philosophy that was, it seems, constructed from little bits and pieces of what he picked up and what he conceived himself. And as anyone who knows the man's history will be aware of, he got into a great deal of trouble for these beliefs. I mean, it was not really accepted to hold a belief system outside of the standard that was imposed by the church at the time in Britain, and as a result he was forced to go into exile. But I'd be fascinated to know where this belief system came from initially, when he first began to formulate it. And I'd love to know from the horse's mouth, as it were, what his perspectives were on spirituality and on metaphysics and so on and so forth. The most you can really get from his poetry are little snippets, etc. I mean, his poetry is beautiful, it's absolutely stunning, but his reliance on imagery makes it so open to interpretation that it's very difficult to determine what Blake himself actually believed. The most really you can say about it is that it's a very non-standard form of Christianity. It's this wild, very abstruse form of Christian mysticism in which the imagery of Christianity, the notion of sacrifice and resurrection and redemption, etc., etc., are used as metaphors for an entirely more personal form of transcendence, if you like. And I find that absolutely fascinating. And so much more progressive and enlightened, if you like, than the more monolithic forms of Christianity that existed then and which still exist today. It seems to me what Blake did is what a lot of the more enlightened Christians around the world today do, and that is, rather than unthinkingly taking the stories of the Bible and regarding them as absolute word-by-word truth, he took what he desired or required from the stories and from his own interpretations of the stories, and then left what was unnecessary behind. And I'm entirely enamoured of that status. It's not one I hold myself, obviously, but that is a position I can respect enormously. And I get the impression from his poetry, from his paintings and his writings on various subjects, that he would just be the most fascinating man to sit down and have a conversation with. Others I would like to visit are kind of obvious, really. I would love to speak to Dante and to Milton. I'd like to speak to Coleridge. Byron, if I could visit him in his pre-syphilis days, probably a bit more than talk. Same goes for the Earl of Rochester. Pre-sexually transmitted disease days, fantastic. And like yourself, Rowan, having recently bought this Philosophy in the Boudoir by the Marquis de Sade, and I'm enjoying it immensely, by the way. Yes, I think I'd have to echo your own sentiments. The Marquis de Sade, absolutely. I would absolutely love to talk to the man. Especially since, as you yourself pointed out, Rowan, he seems to be a man who is composed entirely of contradictions. I suppose you could argue that we all are to a certain degree. But he seems to be a man who wears his contradictions on his sleeve, so to speak. In point of fact, you know, I could sit here and rattle off names all day of people whom I would like to go back and visit or speak to or whatever. Most of them would be artists or poets. But yes, if I had to pick one, it would be Blake. As for those I tag in turn, they will be in the sidebar.